So welcome everybody to Getting Acquainted with PhoneGap. Today we have Joseph Lebrecht joining us, and he's a senior interactive software engineer for the University of Denver, and he specializes in the creation of expressive desktop, web, and mobile solutions. His work incorporates a strong focus on the Adobe Flash platform alongside more general web standard initiatives that include HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, and related technologies. He's also the proprietor of Fractured Vision Media, LLC, which is a digital media production company. He also does technical consultancy, and he's a distribution vehicle for a variety of creative works. He's also an author of a number of written and recorded publications, and he speaks regularly at conferences such as Adobe Max. He's also a member of Adobe Education Leaders and Adobe Community Professionals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joseph to go ahead and talk to us about getting acquainted with PhoneGap. Joseph, are you there?
Okay, thanks, Leslie. So this is Getting Acquainted with PhoneGap, and what we'll be talking about in this session concerns these points here. It should be a very sort of general overview of what PhoneGap is, how to use it, some of the workflow options that you have, and then how to do some testing, debugging, compilation, and deployment onto app stores and things like that. So it should be from A to Z, just a general overview. Of course, any one of these particular points can be explored further, but to get you familiar with it all, here it is. As was mentioned, I am Joseph Lebrecht, and here's some information about myself here. So I work for the University of Denver. I'm highly affiliated with a number of Adobe communities. I'm an author with lynda.com and PeachPit and such. So developing mobile applications, there's lots of different choices out there, but they're mostly broken down into three separate silos. Those silos being ones of native, purely web-based applications, and then hybrid solutions. When you're dealing with native, you're dealing with platform SDKs. So if you're developing for iOS, you're probably using Xcode on a Mac, and you're using Apple's iOS SDK. You're writing in Objective-C, and you're deploying only to Apple iOS. If you're targeting Google Android, you're probably going to be using the Android SDK on whatever platform you want, and are using Java to actually write the applications. Another option is web. So these are applications that are meant to be viewed on mobile, but are actually hosted like websites. So little web-based applications that can adapt to various screen sizes. So using responsive web technologies to actually have things adapt to a phone, to a tablet, but provide some sort of functionality. And a lot of these can behave very much like an app. It's an often overlooked option for a lot of mobile applications because people seem to want a lot of their stuff in the App Store itself. So the third option, and this is where PhoneGap actually lies, is this sort of hybrid solution where you're developing in some other technology or some other platform, and then you either compile down to an application, such as the case if you're using like Flash, you can compile down to Adobe Air, which can then be distributed as an APK through the Android store or through iOS or whatever. And then you have wrapped applications. And applications that use a wrapper, PhoneGap is a platform that does this. It's basically you write your stuff using web technologies, and then PhoneGap acts as this additional layer between your actual application code and the operating system itself. So introducing PhoneGap. So mobile applications built with web standards. And this is what makes PhoneGap so appealing to a lot of people. You've got so many people out there actually using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for general web that they can adapt this technology that I already know and just push it a little bit farther with this PhoneGap wrapper in order to compile applications that run on various devices. So the way PhoneGap works right now is it uses a command line API, and it uses this through Node.js. So a lot of people are starting to use Node to develop a number of different things, both utilities for the desktop, but also actually using Node as a server to write JavaScript server-side, right? So PhoneGap and Cordova both actually use Node.js now, and this has been true since version 3. So a little bit about the distinction between Cordova and PhoneGap. A little bit of history. A couple of years ago, Adobe made some interesting shifts in both the Flash space and on the HTML front. So one thing that they did is they acquired this company called Nitobi, which Nitobi was the previous careholder of PhoneGap. So they acquired PhoneGap by acquiring Nitobi. And what they did with it is instead of just making PhoneGap this internal thing, they actually donated PhoneGap to the Apache Foundation. And the Apache Software Foundation decided to rename their version of PhoneGap to Cordova. And you'll note here that it's similar to what Adobe did with Flex. So if you're familiar with Flex, Adobe had this robust framework called Flex that ran on the Flash platform. And at the same time that they donated PhoneGap to Apache, they also donated Flex to Apache. So now Apache Flex and Apache Cordova are both maintained by the Apache Software Foundation. However, with PhoneGap specifically, Cordova is seen as sort of where all the development happens, where all the bleeding edge stuff happens within PhoneGap. The Cordova project, when it's ready, gets released as a specific version, and then Adobe adopts that version as Adobe PhoneGap. So really there isn't too much of a real distinction between PhoneGap and Cordova, except that PhoneGap is sort of like Adobe's distribution of Cordova, if that makes sense. So they're really the same thing. So again, one of the great things about PhoneGap is that you can use HTML and CSS to design your applications. You can use JavaScript for the functionality of the application. PhoneGap being a wrapper, and it uses the web view on the operating system. So like on Android, whatever the default web view is on that OS, that's what it's going to use to render everything. On iOS, it's going to use the default web view on there, which on iOS you only have one choice, and that's, of course, WebKit. So if things can actually display correctly and run correctly on WebKit, then there's a good chance that everything's going to run just fine on the mobile device. One of the nice things about using these technologies to write for mobile, as opposed to writing stuff for the browser and the desktop, is that you don't have that same level of fragmentation across web browsers on mobile that you do on the desktop. One additional thing that PhoneGap does, since it's acting as a wrapper and a go-between between the OS and your code, you can also tap into a number of the native capabilities of the operating system. So things like access to contacts or the camera, making phone calls, things like that. So PhoneGap can target a pretty wide array of operating systems. Usually we're talking about Android and iOS, but there's actually a lot more that can be targeted with the same technology. And for a lot of applications, you can write the base code, and probably 95% of it can pass over amongst these things. Where it's going to differ, of course, is if you want to target things that are specific to, let's say, BlackBerry 10 or specific to Windows Phone. Some of that stuff might not work appropriately when targeting like iOS or Android. So this is where kind of the problematic stuff comes in. The more you push it, towards the native capabilities that the device has, the more you're going to deviate from that sort of generalized code base. So the actual setup of PhoneGap in your local environment can actually be quite a task if you haven't done it before. There are a number of steps depending on what you want to do and which platforms you actually want to target. There are some similarities, though, between everything. As I mentioned before, you're going to need to install Node.js with the Node Package Manager, and you're going to need to install PhoneGap. Those are the two basic requirements for actually getting started with PhoneGap. So Node.js, of course, you can just download from the web, install it, and then once Node is running, you install PhoneGap, and we'll see how this happens in a little bit. Things, depending upon, again, your workflow and what you want to target, you can download Ripple, and Ripple is actually downloaded through and installed through Node.js as well, through a command. And what Ripple does is it emulates a device within your web browser. So it uses Chrome to actually emulate a lot of things like geolocation, sizes, a lot of device events like the device ready event and so forth that's built into PhoneGap itself. It'll emulate that stuff for you. So it's pretty useful. If you're doing something like Android development, you want to download the Java JDK, the native Android SDK, and Ant in order to get all that stuff working. So again, those are optional, but if you're targeting one specific platform, you might as well grab all that stuff down. For iOS, it would be a little simpler. You just have to download the developer kit for that system. And for anything else, BlackBerry or whatever, just grab that stuff and install it. So Node.js itself, you just download it and you install PhoneGap into there. It's all command line driven, and one of the really cool things about it is that it is easy to automate. So if you had a system where you wanted to just automate different particular versions of PhoneGap, if you wanted to make sure it always pulled down the latest version before you started playing with it, you could always write something that does that. Or if you wanted to write tools on top of that, it's entirely possible to do so. So the configuration of PhoneGap itself, here you can see I have a command line window open, and I simply say npm, which is Node Package Manager. I tell it to install PhoneGap. That's going to grab the latest PhoneGap down from the package manager and build it into the local system. It's really automated. There's a whole bunch of stuff, as you can see, that gets pulled down and installed, but really it's pretty hands-off, even though we are dealing with the command line here. And interesting note, this is also how you update PhoneGap to a new version. So let's say we're running PhoneGap 3.4 right now, and this really cool feature comes out in 3.6. So we're like, oh, well, we want to grab that. All you have to do is run that command again, and it'll reinstall PhoneGap to that latest version. Oops. So project generation. Once you actually download PhoneGap and have it installed, you need to create an application project. And to do that, hold on, what did I do? So PhoneGap configuration, we just went over. Okay, so creating the test application. So you just invoke PhoneGap, create, and then just whatever the name of your application is. So here I'm calling the application test app, but you can call it whatever you want, of course. So this creates a basic application structure within your kind of user directory. It could be, depending on your system, if you're on Windows, it could be like your My Documents directory. You could specify it as another partition. For instance, here you can see I've got the partition Z that I'm using to do all my PhoneGap stuff on. However you want to set up your local system, it's actually very, very flexible. So this creates the project, and at this point there's absolutely nothing in there that's particular to Android, to iOS, or any other platform. It's just a simple skeletal project. And if you open that up, you can see a number of different folders in there. You've got a Cordova folder, merges, platforms, plugins, and www. www is the one that you want to pay attention for development. That contains all the code, so the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript that you actually want to use and modify to build out your application. All of the other stuff is either platform-specific stuff goes in there, different builds when you compile go in there, and so forth. Most of that you can really just let PhoneGap take care of. The only place you really need to do is that www. And of course, inside of the command line, you just cd into your application name, because that's the directory that's actually created for you. So how do you develop your apps? So I'm going to go over some different tools and frameworks that I found to be pretty useful when messing around with PhoneGap and putting apps together. And you can imagine, since we're dealing with web technologies, that there's a vast array of different frameworks, whether it's JavaScript frameworks, CSS frameworks, you know, a bunch of different tools from Adobe and from Google and all over the place. You've got tons of choices. So when you start off, you've got your basic directory, your project. It's bare. You don't really have anything in there except some basic code to get you started. Right now, it's just using sort of that plain web technology view. And you can go with that if you want to. So you don't even have to deal with any sort of native SDKs. So, you know, you've got the two options. If you use native SDKs, you'll have to go and download those additional tools. And I see a chat message coming across here. Hold on a sec. Okay, is there a message, organizer?
Yeah, I'm on here. Someone has their hand raised. So if they want to, I guess, pose their question in the question
Maybe
box.
we'll just, you know, anything that you guys want to put in the chat, we can answer later on. I know that we're still trying to get used to how this particular piece of software for webinars is organized. So let's handle it like that. Like if you want to put stuff in the chat or ask questions, I'm sure that Leslie will convey them as need be. So I'm going to continue here. So using the native SDKs, again, you have to download those additional tools. So if it's for Android, the Android developer tools, and you know, you probably have to download Ant and a bunch of stuff that you have to configure with the path on your system and so forth. So, you know, it depends on what you're sort of doing and how you want to work. If you want to work through the Android emulator, you're definitely going to need to download those tools. If you're going to just use Ripple, you don't have to. So again, that's lots of work initially, but it provides you with more options. If you're using plain web technology, you're just working in that www folder and writing all of your code in there. And when you're done, you don't even have to compile it on your local system with PhoneGap. You can just zip it up and upload it to the PhoneGap build service, and it'll compile it for you for iOS, for Android, for any of those different things. So you've got some options here. So no matter what you're doing, you're going to have to, of course, edit your code. So this is Brackets. Brackets is a code editor that focuses on web technology. So it really only is built for editing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's very simple, but in that simplicity, you know, it kind of takes away a lot of the complexity of bulkier IDEs. So, you know, if you're using Eclipse for stuff, you know that's got a ton of options. If you're using Dreamweaver, there's a ton of stuff in there that you might not need. Brackets is just a very simple code editor. What's interesting about Brackets is that it actually has Node.js built into it. So you don't need to install an additional web server for testing your stuff, right? So you can just launch it from Brackets and it'll run. So you won't get those sandboxing errors that you often get when working in JavaScript. So it also has this live view feature where as you're editing things inside of the editor, you can actually see the changes taking place within Chrome, within the browser. So that's an additional thing that you might find useful. Edge Code CC, which you may have heard of, is actually Adobe's sort of branded version of Brackets. So Brackets itself is under community control. It's not like an Apache thing like Flex or Cordova is, but it is, you know, hosted on GitHub. People can contribute it and do contribute to it. And Brackets, they make a new sprint like every couple weeks, and then Adobe will take that code base and create edge code from it, different milestones. So we've got Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver is an older product. A lot of people are very familiar with that, and a lot of people are really comfortable with it because it does provide that sort of WYSIWYG view. You know, it's got multiple styles of working. What people don't remember when it comes to Dreamweaver is that you can actually just use it as a code editor. You can type anything in there, and it's got a lot of nice sort of auto-completion and things like that. What I find really nice to use Dreamweaver for when dealing with PhoneGap, and you can see it illustrated here in this image, is you've got this nice split view with a live WebKit instance. So I've got that split view right here. You know, I'm sort of emulating the view of a mobile application, and since we're dealing with just JavaScript and HTML, I can actually run that live view, and it'll all render through that WebKit engine that's built into Dreamweaver itself. Dreamweaver also has PhoneGap build integration, so if you are taking that route where you just want to edit stuff with web technologies, it makes it very easy to push that stuff up to PhoneGap build and get your APKs and whatever other format you need back. So Edge Animate CC, it's DOM-based HTML animation. So some interesting things with this is that you have sort of that fully responsive scaling of the entire stage, the entire project if you want to. So one of the neat things about using Flash is that, you know, for years we've been able to make that super responsive. We can adjust things as the stage adjusts, and we can scale things appropriately. Edge CC with this last version actually has fully responsive scaling. So any text you put in there, any images, really any content whatsoever, even the animation, it's all going to scale appropriately if you want it to do that. And it makes a project, once you render it, really good to actually put inside of a PhoneGap application. One of the things that people have initially, people see as a problem with something like PhoneGap is because you are dealing with HTML and CSS, you know, that's sometimes a bit limiting by itself, but using something like Edge Animate or some of the GreenSock tweening libraries, JS libraries, and you know, some jQuery UI and other things like that, you can actually make things a little more dynamic when it comes to embedding content within your PhoneGap application. So Edge Reflow, here you can actually visually prototype a responsive web design. So even if you're not doing stuff necessarily with PhoneGap, you can always just use this sort of thing, because the way it works is it works along with the different breakpoints that you would use in a media query if you were writing the CSS by hand, except you can actually visually see that and make visual adjustments to this stuff. So in terms of PhoneGap, you can design your UI. Like if you don't want to use something really heavyweight like jQuery Mobile or Bootstrap to actually lay out your page, if you want to just kind of design the whole thing yourself, Reflow is a really good choice to do that with PhoneGap, because you can just design it all visually and just include what you need in there. So this might come as a surprise to people, but Flash Professional is actually a really good option as well. So I've got some stats here. Flash is dead. Of course it's not. But the newest version of Flash Pro CC can actually publish to HTML5 canvas, and you can integrate that with PhoneGap. It uses a library called Create.js, which is an entirely JavaScript-based library that writes to canvas. So in this case, you're not even dealing with the DOM. You're creating a little canvas object on the stage and just writing different animation and interactivity to that object. So again, this is an older product, so if people are really used to working in Flash Professional to build things, then they can definitely use Flash Professional output to HTML5 canvas and integrate that into a PhoneGap application view. If you want to go with the full sort of framework, there's, of course, endless options. So I list a couple here. There's always jQuery Mobile, Twitter Bootstrap, which is, I've used both of these, and they both work pretty well inside of PhoneGap. There's also CSS-based frameworks such as Topcoat. It's a purely CSS UI library. You can look that up. We've also got JS libraries like Angular and Backbone that you can use to develop full JavaScript applications. So you can, if you're familiar with Angular, if familiar with Backbone, you can actually, use that to write your PhoneGap application. That's your development framework. And as I mentioned here, there's many, many more aside from this, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So what if you want to take it beyond the web standards? So, taking your application and actually using some of the neat features that actually come into PhoneGap. How do you do that? Well, PhoneGap has a number of different features built into it, and then it also has sort of a plug-in model. So some of the features that are core to PhoneGap include access to the accelerometer, camera, compass, contacts file, geolocation, media, the network, a number of different notifications, and local storage. And this is, of course, on top of anything that HTML5 just sort of inherently has in there. You can, of course, use any of that stuff as well. You've also got this plugin model that you can use, where the plugins actually extend the core of PhoneGap. And the way you install any of these things is you just say PhoneGap plugin add, and then you pass in the actual address to that particular plugin. So you can see here, I'm incorporating geolocation by adding org.apache.cordova.geolocation. And some examples of these: barcode scanners, Facebook Connect, Google Analytics plugins, status bar access, Bluetooth. So you can see there's lots and lots of possibilities. And you can, of course, write your own if you want to. If you want to actually see a number of these sort of supported plugins inside of PhoneGap build service itself, you can go to build.phonegap.com/plugins and view like a whole list of those there. So what about testing and debugging and distribution and things like that? One of the easiest ways to do it is just to use Ripple. And you can use Ripple whether you have your setup for native development, or if you're setting up things just editing through HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can use Ripple in either case. You install it through Node.js, so you say npm, so Node Package Manager, install Ripple emulator. That'll install Ripple onto your local system, and when you invoke Ripple emulate, what'll actually happen is it'll launch Chrome with Ripple enabled. The only catch here is that you have to make sure to actually build your project first each time, because if you don't do that, then it's not going to emulate correctly and it won't display your changes. But you can see here Ripple's really neat. It creates a little local host for you, so you can see port 4400 here, and it's emulating a specific Cordova instance in this case, so Cordova PhoneGap 3.0, and you can change that within the Ripple emulator. And the actual image you see there is the sort of skeletal test app that's created when you create a fresh project through PhoneGap. So once you create that project, you actually have this all ready to go. And using this, you can emulate a number of different screen device sizes. You can change the orientation. You can fire off device-specific events to see if your application responds to them or not. So you can see here you've got device ready, which is something that's specific to PhoneGap that you could try. You want to listen to that before you start doing anything in your application, right? So it's super, super useful to emulate with Ripple, and it's not difficult at all. So emulating with native SDKs, here you can see I'm emulating with Android. So you just say PhoneGap run Android that'll both build and run the actual application in Android for you. So if you've got your emulator running, so if you've installed the Android development tools and you've set up a little virtual machine and you've got it running in the background, which is what you see right here, PhoneGap will actually detect that, install the application, and launch it for you to go test. You can also plug in a device, of course, and when you go and say run Android, it'll actually look for a device first. So if you see a device, if it sees a device, it'll install it on your device, and you can test on device, which is of course very important as well. So to build a release locally, you simply say PhoneGap build, and then whatever platform you want to build. So in this case, I'm building for Android, so I just say PhoneGap build Android. If I wanted to do it for iOS, I could do that, or any of those other platforms, and it'll create that for us. And it's very important that you, of course, don't edit any of the files within that platforms folder within your project directory, because that'll really screw things up, so don't do that. So updating an application, we already talked about how to update PhoneGap itself when we talked about installing PhoneGap. So if you've already got applications and you want to upgrade them to a newer version of PhoneGap, then you just go in there and say PhoneGap platform update, and then just say what particular platform you want to update. So using PhoneGap build, of course, is really useful if you want to, if you don't want to deal with all those native SDKs and all that extra setup in your local environment. If you just want to work in web technologies using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can just do that within that www folder. And you'll notice within that folder there's a config.xml. So that config file, what that does is it instructs PhoneGap build how you want the application to be built. So it has certain Android-specific settings in there, ones for iOS, and so forth and so on. You can specify splash screens in there, application icon sizes, and all sorts of different things. There's two ways to actually get your application up into PhoneGap build. So one is to upload a zip file of all your files in that www directory. And the other way is if you're using GitHub, you can link to a Git repository and just tell it to pull from that repository. Another benefit of using PhoneGap build is this concept of hydration. If you enable hydration on your PhoneGap build project, what that does is it allows the applications that are distributed already to then update themselves. So what will happen is, say you've got a group of users that you want to distribute this application to. They've got the application. You go ahead and make a new build of the application. You push it up to PhoneGap build. If you have enabled hydration when you went up there, all of those users, once the compile is done for that specific platform, they'll see a notification when they open up the application that hydration has found a new version of the application. They can install it right there and test. So it's pretty useful for testing. So to make that a little bit easier, there's a number of different utilities out there, of course. One is this config.gap utility. So it actually creates or modifies the configuration files for you. And again, this is useful for PhoneGap build. And it's made with Air and Flash, so it's cross-platform. So if you're on iOS or Windows, you can just use this application. And you can see by this screenshot, there's actually a ton of options here. So permissions, splash screens, icons, all sorts of stuff, even plugins. So you can get that from configgap.com, and that's a really useful utility to have when working with PhoneGap and PhoneGap build. So about deployment and publication, this of course is going to depend upon the particular application store that you're going to be using, or maybe you're just distributing it over your internal network. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. The way most people do it is they go to a couple different app stores. So go into Google Play and upload your APK, upload your certs, get everything up there, and you've got to give it a title, a description, what countries you want it to be distributed to, if you're charging for it, how much money you're actually going to require people in different countries to have. And this, of course, varies widely by app stores. When you do it for iOS, there's an entirely different process than when you do it for Android. So my particular workflow, what I found works really good for me, and of course, just like regular web development, this is going to change from person to person. But I normally test using brackets, first of all, because I don't have to even deal with compiling. And this is really useful when you're laying out your application and editing the basic HTML and CSS and so forth, because you can immediately see what's going on. The next step is to emulate with Ripple. So once you start getting into sort of the meat of it, you want to try to look for those device-ready stuff and different things to fire off. You can do that with Ripple. If you want to take it a step further, you can always emulate with native tools. So, using the Android emulator or the iOS emulator or whatever. If you want to take it even further, you can start debugging on the device. So PhoneGap actually supports debugging on the device, and it'll report back into your local Chrome browser and so forth. If you have a set of test users, use the hydration to test on multiple devices. Chances are most of us only have 1 or 2 devices that we can test on. So, getting people in your department, in your organization to actually help you test is super useful. Then you build a release build and you go to distribution. So just a couple other things that I'd like to share concerning mobile and resources that I can provide. Not necessarily to do with PhoneGap, but I do have a course on lynda.com which talks about building mobile apps with Feathers and Starling using Air. And my latest book is all about Edge Animate, so if you wanted to use that when you're developing stuff in PhoneGap, it's completely able to do it. And you can go to Amazon and find that. So here's my contact information. I'll take questions right here and now. But if you do come up with things later on, you can always email me or hit me up at Twitter, and I'll be able to answer those questions there.
Okay, so we did have one.
I guess we have some questions right now. Is that right?
Sorry, yeah. Stephen asked, is it possible to connect to cloud databases as I do with PHP?
Oh, sorry, my speakers were off. Can you say that again?
Sorry. Stephen asked, is it possible to connect to cloud databases as I do with PHP?
Sure. The thing is, what's going to be different when doing something with PhoneGap and interacting with PHP is you're probably going to want to set up like an API that you can use on your web server, so using PHP, and basically just make AJAX calls from your PhoneGap application to PHP on the web server, and then when that data comes back down, you can do whatever you want with it. So using like PHP or ASP or Cold Fusion or whatever, you're not going to be able to run that stuff in the application itself, but there's no reason that you can't build out APIs on the server and then use those APIs through your PhoneGap application.
Okay, so if anybody else has any questions, you can ask them in either the question box or the chat. Within a day after the webinar, you guys should get an email with a link to take a survey. We'd love to have you take that and get your feedback. Thanks, Joseph, for talking to us today. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in.
Yeah, and again, this is like a good sort of general overview of all the stuff that can go into PhoneGap. So, you can find lots of material online that goes into much greater detail about the development process and different frameworks to use and methodologies and so forth. So.
Okay, so we're getting more questions in. So Stephen asks, how do we download PhoneGap?
Okay, so to download PhoneGap, you would basically download Node.js, and then you would install it from there. So let's see. I've got a slide at the beginning that kind of goes over that, so I'll pull that up quick. Almost there. Oh yeah, so download Node.js and install it. Once that's installed, you just go into a command line and you invoke the Node package manager, and you simply say npm install -g PhoneGap, and that's going to grab it down and install it for you. And that process is automated, so you won't have to answer a bunch of questions as it's installing or anything like that.
Okay, and then Lisa asked, would this be doable by a non-coder?
It depends on what you're doing, right? So just think about web applications themselves that are just hosted on a basic web server. So of course you can get somebody who goes into Dreamweaver and just uses WYSIWYG and creates a bunch of just text and images and stuff like that, and maybe does a little of the sort of wizardry interactive stuff in there if they feel compelled to, for a little bit of interactivity. And you could package something like that up as a PhoneGap application, and in that case, no, like the person doing it doesn't have to be like a hardcore developer or anything. But you've got the flip side too, where maybe you're writing this really intense application. You can definitely use all of your development skills to do that using something like Angular, to go through and build a real JavaScript application with a basic single page app view or whatever you're doing. So it really runs the gamut just like web development does.
Okay, excuse me, then I don't know, you probably won't know the answer to this, but Wendy asked, what kinds of apps do local governments develop? What do they do? Wendy, that might be a great question to pose on the listserv to see if anybody has developed any apps with PhoneGap and could provide us with some examples.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with specific examples. There's a couple that I show right here, like the BBC Olympics app was written in PhoneGap. There's this little game, simple card type game that was written in PhoneGap here. And I know these have nothing to do with government. Untapped has a application. There's different calculators and things like that written in PhoneGap. So, I mean, really, if they, I don't know what they're doing in particular, but just about anything that they would normally do on their website that could take advantage of something like geolocation. Like think of maybe like parking services, like maybe some kind of sensors on parking meters, and you could see like what meters are free and which aren't, or public transit. So being able to see if your train or your bus is late, anything like that could be done, as long as the infrastructure is in place.
Okay, and then Lisa asked, do you have a course on lynda.com that covers building a simple app with PhoneGap?
I don't have anything with PhoneGap, but a friend of mine actually just wrapped a recording on PhoneGap. He's actually the same guy who wrote the ConfigGap application. So, since he just finished recording on that, it's probably going to be maybe a month or two before that's up there, but there's definitely one that's coming.
Okay, do we have any more questions out there? Just monitoring the question box and I'm not seeing any. Okay, so thank you for your time today, Joseph. This was very informative, and we'll be scheduling more NAGWA webinars in the future, and I'll be posting a recording and a link to Joseph's slides on SlideShare for you guys in a week or so. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.